The words, "And that's the last one," sent a wave of nausea through my stomach as I watched my daughter's face. Amelia's eyes fixed on the empty space beneath the Christmas tree, her fingers twisting into the fabric of her red velvet dress. I saw her throat work once, twice as she swallowed whatever emotion threatened to escape. Not a single tear, not a question, just the slow, deliberate smoothing of her dress with hands that trembled slightly. Around us, 23 family members continued their conversations as if nothing had happened, as if every child in the room hadn't received a beautifully wrapped present except mine. Wrapping paper rustled underfoot. Someone turned the music louder. My husband's mother, Frances, glanced at Amelia, then deliberately looked away, lips curving into a smile as she complimented her other grandchildren on their gifts. Amelia had spent 3 evenings crafting a special card for her grandmother, carefully applying gold glitter to the edges, practicing her neatest handwriting for the message inside. Earlier, she had whispered, "Should I give Grandma my card before or after she gives me my present?" Now that card sat forgotten in her lap as she stared at her empty hands. "My name is Rachel. I'm 34 and a former elementary school teacher. This is the story of how I learned that the loudest statements are often made in silence. This was our 11th Christmas with my husband Tim's family. I knew the rhythm by now, the perfectly decorated 2-story home outside Pittsburgh, the meticulously arranged buffet, the color-coded wrapping paper Frances insisted upon. I understood my place in this family, perpetually on the outside, tolerated but never truly included. Frances had perfected the art of making her disapproval known without ever saying anything directly. "Oh, you wore your hair like that tonight," she'd say, smiling while her eyes communicated something entirely different. I'd learned not to react. Tim loved his family, and I didn't want to create tension. I watched as Amelia found her place among cousins who received far more attention than she did. She was 9, old enough to notice the imbalance, but too young to call it out. Each year, I told myself I was overthinking things. Each year, the knot in my stomach grew tighter. When we arrived tonight, Frances had barely acknowledged Amelia, offering only a distracted, "Oh, hello, sweetie," before turning away to adjust ornaments that were already perfectly placed. I saw the momentary confusion on Amelia's face before she recovered, smoothing her expression into a careful smile. Tim squeezed my hand but said nothing. Now, as I watched my daughter sitting alone amid the celebration, that familiar ache of protectiveness swelled inside me. I leaned forward to say something, anything, but before I could speak, Tim stood up. My husband wasn't one for confrontation. In 11 years of marriage, I'd seen him diffuse arguments with quiet words and strategic retreats. His family dynamics weren't mine to fix, he'd often said, but something had shifted in him tonight. His jaw tightened as he walked to the fireplace, reached behind one of the stockings, and pulled out a white envelope. He'd placed it there when we first arrived, I realize now, during that moment when he'd excused himself to hang our coats. "This," he said, his voice cutting through the room's chatter, "was supposed to be opened last." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Frances narrowed her eyes, wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. Every person in that overly decorated living room turned to stare as Tim walked the envelope to Amelia and placed it in her hands. For the first time all evening, our daughter became visible to everyone. Amelia looked up at her father, confusion evident in her eyes. The envelope was plain, no decoration, no name written on the front, nothing like the elaborate packages the other children had received. "Go ahead, sweetheart," Tim said gently. "Open it." She glanced at me, seeking permission. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion I couldn't express. "It's okay." Frances crossed her arms, her mouth pressed into a thin, irritated line. Her husband Richard cleared his throat but remained silent. Tim's sister Gina shifted uncomfortably in her seat. With careful movements, Amelia opened the envelope and pulled out 2 things, a small stack of folded papers and a handwritten note. She read the note first, her lips moving silently as she processed the words. When she finished, she looked up at Tim with widening eyes. "What does it say?" I asked, my voice barely steady. She looked down again and read aloud. "To my daughter, Amelia, for the girl who brings light wherever she goes. Let's chase the northern lights this year. Iceland awaits. Love, Dad. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the Christmas music seemed to fade into nothing. Amelia unfolded the papers to reveal 2 printed tickets, one adult, one child, first-class round trip from Philadelphia to Reykjavik. I stared at Tim, stunned. You planned this? Weeks ago, he replied, not taking his eyes off Amelia. The same night she told me she wanted to see stars somewhere without streetlights. I remembered that conversation. Amelia had been looking out the car window, asking why stars looked different in certain places. Tim had explained about light pollution and remote locations where the sky seemed endless. She'd asked if we could go someday. He had said maybe. Now I understood why he'd been checking our calendar so often and why he'd been taking those private work calls in his car over the past month. Amelia stood up, still clutching the envelope and tickets. We're really going. Her voice was small but clear, cutting through the uncomfortable silence. Tim knelt to her level. We are. You and me. Northern lights, hot chocolate, snowmobiles, all of it. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his neck. Her shoulders trembled slightly, not with tears, but with a joy so intense it needed physical expression. For the first time that evening, she wasn't pretending to be fine. She didn't have to. I felt my eyes burn with unshed tears. This wasn't just a trip. It was a declaration. Our daughter had been made invisible, and now her father was ensuring she was seen in the most undeniable way. Across the room, Frances's expression hardened. She picked up a discarded piece of wrapping paper and meticulously folded it, as though this task required her complete attention. Richard cleared his throat again but remained silent. Tim stood and put his arm around me. She needed something that wouldn't be forgotten, he said, his voice carrying through the silent room. So I made sure it wouldn't be. Gina approached nervously. That's incredible, Tim. Iceland? It's her dream, he replied simply. I figured Christmas was the right time for something unforgettable. Frances didn't say a word. She stood slowly, smoothed her sweater, and walked toward the kitchen. I watched her go, and for the first time in 11 years, I didn't care what she thought. She had made her choice. We had made ours. Mom, are you coming too? Amelia asked, looking up at me with shining eyes. Not this time, baby, I said. This is just for you and Daddy. She hugged me next fiercely, and I held her like she might dissolve if I let go too soon. This moment belonged to her, all of it. The dynamic in the room shifted visibly. Amelia stayed close to Tim for the rest of the evening, the envelope clutched in one hand and her grandmother's card in the other. She didn't mention the card again. She didn't ask why she hadn't received a gift like the others. It was as if the weight of being forgotten had lifted the moment she felt chosen. The other children noticed. Amelia's cousin Olivia came over to ask about the trip. Then Logan joined with questions about volcanoes. For the first time all night, Amelia was at the center of attention. Not because someone had invited her in, but because something about her had become undeniable. Tim didn't boast. He sat with his arm around Amelia, quietly answering her questions about Iceland, describing glaciers and black sand beaches as if he'd visited dozens of times. He hadn't, but I realized he must have spent hours researching every detail. This wasn't spontaneous. He had anticipated this moment exactly. I slipped into the kitchen for a bottle of water and found Frances arranging store-bought cookies on a tray with mechanical precision. Her lips were tight, her movements stiff. She glanced up as I entered. That was quite the announcement, she said, her voice clipped. I didn't respond immediately. I retrieved the water and closed the refrigerator door. The silence between us grew taut. She turned back to her tray. You know, it would have been nice to know about that ahead of time so we could avoid this kind of scene. This kind of scene? I asked, keeping my voice deliberately calm. Frances placed a cookie with unnecessary force. Making a child feel excluded on Christmas doesn't reflect well on this family. She didn't make herself feel excluded, I said, and neither did I, she noticed. Everyone did. Frances looked at me for a moment, then returned to her task. It wasn't intentional. We had so many to keep track of this year. Gina's children, the cousins from Detroit. Things slipped through the cracks. She's not a slip, I said. She's your granddaughter. Her hand paused mid-arrangement. I didn't mean... But you did, I interrupted. You've always meant to keep me and her just outside the circle. You've never tried to hide it. Tonight was just the first time it showed that clearly to everyone else. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I waited for an apology that never came. I walked out, leaving her alone with her perfect tray of cookies. Back in the living room, Amelia sat by the fireplace describing the blue ice caves she'd seen in a video about Iceland from the travel documentary we'd watched last weekend. Her eyes sparkled with renewed energy. I sat beside Tim and leaned against him. You knew this might happen, I said quietly. He nodded. I saw the list Frances made last week when we were here for dinner. Amelia wasn't on it. I asked her about it, and she said it was just a draft, but I knew. You didn't tell me. I wanted to, but I also wanted to give Amelia something no one else could take away, something private, something just for her. I looked at him. You gave her so much more than a trip. He glanced at Amelia, then back at me. She'll never forget tonight, but now she'll remember how it ended. As families began to leave, several people congratulated Amelia on her trip. Some complimented Tim on the idea. Frances remained in the kitchen, pretending not to notice the shift in the room's energy. Amelia approached me as I gathered our coats. She held up her card. Should I still give this to Grandma? I looked at it. The gold glitter had smudged slightly at the corners, but the drawing was still bright and hopeful. You can, I said, but you don't have to. She stared at the card for a long moment. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it into her backpack. I want to keep it, she said. That was the most powerful choice she could have made. We drove home in silence for the first 20 minutes. Amelia fell asleep in the back seat, the envelope tucked between her arms like a precious keepsake. Her red bow had slipped from her curls, and her cheek pressed against the window, fogging the glass with each soft breath. Finally, Tim spoke. I hated watching that. I nodded. I know. I should have done more earlier. I saw it coming. I thought maybe Frances would surprise me this year. She didn't, he said simply. I looked at him. His hand gripped the steering wheel, not in anger, but with the steadiness of someone who had made peace with a difficult truth. She made a choice tonight, I said. And so did I, he replied. Did I handle it right? He asked after a moment. You showed up for your daughter when it mattered, I answered. That's always right. When we arrived home, Tim carried Amelia upstairs without waking her. I followed, turned on her nightlight, and pulled the blankets to her chin. She stirred briefly, then turned onto her side, still holding the envelope. I stood in the doorway watching her sleep. Part of me ached for what she had felt earlier, the confusion, the disappointment, the quiet acceptance. But another part felt proud of how she'd handled it, how she hadn't let it define her, and most of all, how she had emerged with her dignity intact. The next morning, Amelia joined us at the breakfast table with a map of Iceland she'd printed from the computer. She asked dozens of questions about geysers, northern lights, and reindeer. She spoke with a new confidence, not just excited about a trip, but with the assurance that comes from being seen fully and loved deeply. Later that day, Tim's phone displayed Frances's name. He stared at the screen for a long moment before silencing it and placing it back on the counter. She'll probably say it was an accident, I said. She will, he replied, but it wasn't. We both knew that, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel compelled to smooth things over. There was nothing left to explain. Family isn't just blood. It's not wrapped in obligations or forced invitations or pretending that love exists when it doesn't. Family is made in the choices we make, in the people we stand beside, in how we show up when it would be easier to remain silent. That night, as I tucked Amelia into bed, she pulled out the card she'd made for Frances, the one she'd chosen not to give. Do you think Grandma will be mad I didn't give her this? She asked. I knelt beside her. I think Grandma will wonder where it went, and maybe that's okay. Amelia looked at the glittery edges, then back at me. Can I keep it just for me? Yes, I said. You can always keep what you do with love, even if it wasn't given to the person you made it for. She smiled. I think I'll keep it in my suitcase. For Iceland. She nodded thoughtfully. So I remember this Christmas. All of it. That was when I realized something important. She wouldn't remember the silence or the missing gift as much as she would remember the moment her father handed her that envelope and everyone turned to see her for the first time. That was the memory she would carry, not the exclusion, the recognition. She wasn't overlooked, not in the way that truly matters. She was chosen. Thanks for spending this time with me and hearing our story. I didn't share it for sympathy. I shared it because I know what it feels like to watch your child be overlooked. And I also know how powerful it is when someone who loves them steps up and makes it right. If this story meant something to you or reminded you of your own family moments, please take a second to like the video. It really helps more people find it. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that quiet love can speak louder than anything else. And if you want more real emotional stories like this one, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. Drop a comment below if you've ever had a moment when someone made your child feel invisible or when someone reminded them just how much they mattered. Thank you for being here.